Teal dear, let's talk today about the good old evolutionary red herring of genetic determinism. Again, somewhat a follow-up to my video Genetic Determinism, the Evolutionary Red Herring, and I suppose also to some erroneous criticisms of my talk with Stardust in which we mentioned consanguinity, some of its potential problems, and how these problems could manifest themselves in increased forms of undesirable behavior. In my video Genetic Determinism, the Evolutionary Red Herring, I introduce people to evolutionary psychology and its most common criticism, the accusation of biological determinism, the notion that humans are predetermined, almost, to carry out certain behaviors based on their genetics, and how this is a laughable notion that is covered and demonstrated why this accusation is massively incorrect, even within a beginner's guide to evolutionary psychology, in which we learn about neuroplasticity and how that too is a part of human biology that helps determine how people behave. Indeed, humans' ability to change their pattern of behavior via brain structure is one of the adaptations that makes them so successful, and yet neuroplasticity is another often cited rebuttal I see to evolutionary psychology, even though evolutionary psychology fully acknowledges and explains the importance of such a process. So let's address another of the common criticisms I hear of evolutionary psychology, the epigenetics argument. As if those who work in biopsychology or evolutionary psychology have simply never heard of this in the 6, 7, 8+ years that it takes to undertake a master's or doctorate in these subjects. It's rather amusing to me that people raise the topic of epigenetics as if it is a counter-argument to a discipline of which it is a major part. I thought it might be nice to address the effects environment has on patterns of behavior and how the same behavior can be made manifest in different ways depending on the environmental stimuli available, since this seems to be what most people mean when they refer to their epigenetic arguments, rather than the actual structural changes brought about via processes such as various kinds of methylation patterns or histone modification, which alters how genes express, which is a more technical part of epigenetics. It seems most people online, when they use the epigenetics argument, are referencing how environment changes behavior and how people's behavior alters to suit the new environment. So let's look at some examples of genetic behaviors and how they change or alter their manifestations depending on environment, and how this change does not in fact indicate some change in actual behavior, but merely behavioral manifestation. In short, the genetics behind the behavior may not have changed, but the behavior seems to, but has in fact remained the same. So let's take a non-controversial one first of all, addiction, specifically alcohol addiction, but we'll expand this out shortly after, and I'll be referencing here an old textbook from back in my very early student days, Foundations of Biopsychology, since the particular example given in this book is always one that has stuck in my mind ever since as one of the best and clearest examples of a biological basis for behaviors, and after this first example, I'll freestyle in some other examples. Studies of twins have provided evidence of a genetic factor in alcoholism. One of the largest studies to examine this issue was undertaken in Sweden by Cage in 1960, who compared 1,974 male twin pairs where one of each pair was known to have an alcohol problem, e.g., they had been convicted of drunkenness or involved in an alcohol-related misdemeanor. The results showed that the concordance rate of identical twins for alcoholism was 54%, compared with 28% for fraternal twins. Although significant, the difference was not particularly marked, especially when considering that most of the twins had been raised in similar environments. This suggested that learning experiences also had an important role to play in this behavior. A similar conclusion was also reached in a more recent report, Pickens et al. 1991, that examined alcoholism in males and females. The results of this study showed that the concordance rate of identical male twins was 76% compared to 61% for fraternal twins, and the corresponding figures for female twins were 36 and 25%. These researchers also estimated that alcoholism was 36% inheritable for men and 26% inheritable for women. In other words, the environment appeared to exert more important influence in causing alcohol abuse. A difficulty with these types of study, as mentioned earlier, is that twins tend to be reared in very similar environments. One way of overcoming this type of problem is to examine subjects who were born to alcoholic parents, but then adopted by non-alcoholic parents. Thus, if this group continued to show a greater incidence of alcohol problems in adulthood, this would provide stronger evidence of a genetic component to drinking behavior. One study of this sort was undertaken by Godwin et al. In 1973, who followed children from alcoholic parents who were adopted at or shortly after birth and were raised by normal or non-alcoholic parents. The results showed that alcoholism was 4 times more likely in the sons of alcoholic fathers compared with sons of non-alcoholic fathers. In other words, the father's genes were appearing to exert an important effect on alcohol-related behaviors in their sons. A Swedish study conducted by Michael Bowman has confirmed and extended these findings. This study was based on a much larger sample of people, 1,125 men and 1,199 women, born to single women between 1930 and 1949 and adopted at an early age. In addition, extensive information about alcohol abuse, mental illness, and medical problems was available for most of these adoptees and for their biological and adoptive parents. The results of this study showed that genetic factors played an important role in alcoholism. For example, Bowman found that the adopted sons of alcoholic fathers were 3 times more likely to become alcoholics than the adopted sons of non-alcoholic fathers. Similarly, adopted sons of alcoholic mothers were twice as likely to become alcoholics as those whose mothers were non-alcoholic. Clearly, if alcoholism has a genetic basis, then it should be possible to identify the genes that contribute to this behavior. Several years ago, a group of researchers led by Kenneth Blum generated much excitement when it was claimed that such a gene had been discovered. Blum et al., 1990 and 1991. These investigators studied the brains of 70 deceased individuals, half of whom had been alcoholics. A sample of frontal cortex was taken from each brain and tested with 9 DNA probes, each of which had been proposed as a possible alcoholism gene from previous research. Only one of these probes matched the DNA found in the brain tissues, and this matched the gene that was responsible for producing the dopamine D2 receptor. Moreover, this gene, which is located in chromosome 11, occurs in 2 different forms, or alleles. The majority of us have a form known as A2 allele, but some have the less common A1 version, and it was the A1 version that was found in the tissue taken from the alcoholic's brains. In fact, this gene was present in 69% of the alcoholic's brains, but absent in 80% of the non-alcoholics. This was an important finding, especially as the dopaminergic system of the brain has been shown to play an important role in reinforcement and pleasure effects of drugs such as cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, and heroin. Here endeth the reading. Now, there was some further research done in regards to a meta-analysis by Noble in 1993 who reviewed 9 studies and compared a total of alcoholics and controls. And they found that the A1 allele existed in about 43% of the alcoholics' brains and 25% of the control subjects. So depending on which studies you're looking at, while the findings are still positive, it's not enough to suggest that the A1 allele by itself is the cause of alcoholism. So we found one trigger. However, there appears to be another. Another neurotransmitter, and presumably a different genetic influence to be implicated in alcoholism, is serotonin. For example, it has been shown that the concentration of 5-HIAA, a breakdown proponent of serotonin, is lower in the cerebrospinal fluid of many alcoholics compared with non-alcoholics of the same age and general health status, from Lovinger in 1997. This observation suggests that alcoholics may have reduced serotonin levels in the brain. Indeed, this possibility was supported by Bollinger et al. In 1979, who measured 5-HIAA levels in abstaining alcoholics. Although the results showed that 5-HIAA levels were relatively normal at 48 hours, they were significantly depressed at 4 weeks. This finding suggested that alcoholics may have naturally low levels of serotonin, which became elevated when they consume alcohol. The obvious implication is that a deficit in serotonin might be responsible for driving the alcoholic to seek and consume alcohol in order to restore the levels of this neurotransmitter in the brain. And there has been rather a lot of research done since then which has indeed confirmed that connection. So, as we can see, the same gene in chromosome 11, specifically allele A1 and A2, seems to play a part in addiction to a variety of substances, along with serotonin deficiencies. In other words, the behavior has an objective biological basis, at least to some degree. This example partially tied to dopamine receptors and sense of reward. Now, the typical biological determinist strawman would come out shouting, "Not all of them were alcoholics," in the typical hashtag fashion that we're increasingly used to seeing these days, and thus conclude that the behavior is therefore nothing to do with genetics, and anyone saying it is being a biological determinist narrow-minded ideologue, or something along those lines. This is where environment comes in. As has been repeatedly stated, at no point when we talk about a genetic basis for behavior are we ever stating that a certain behavior must necessarily manifest either all the time or in a specific way. Indeed, as noted in the presence of both A1 and A2, all the genes have determined, if you will, is that the individual is more likely to be prone to an addictive personality, whether this manifests as alcoholism, drug abuse, or even eating certain foods in excess, or if they even manifest the behavior at all, cannot be known. Indeed, this factor will be determined by environment and what that person has access to in regards to addictive substances. If their environment contains an excess of alcohol, then the likelihood of the addiction being to alcohol increases. If the environment only contains marijuana, then the likelihood of the addiction being to marijuana increases. And to the potheads who are super sensitive and hyper defensive about their drug of choice, no, this is not stating the drug is necessarily addictive. We are looking at addictive personalities and their basis. If the environment contains both these stimuli and more, then the likelihood of the individual being addicted to multiple substances then increases. Of course, there is always the possibility that the individual will control their environment, limiting their exposure to such substances and thus never become addicted to them at all. The biological basis for the behavior is merely an increased likelihood of manifesting a behavior, not the prescription that they must behave in this fashion. However, it is important to note that if you have a population high in both A1 and A2, then you would more than likely see higher rates of addiction than in a population lower in A1 and A2. So determining a genetic base for behavior is not necessarily prescriptive of individuals, but can be used to either determine or explain patterns of propensity within a population. Let's take another example. The example of what men find attractive in women. A far more complex behavior influenced no doubt by multiple genes, almost certainly pleiotropically, needing more than one gene for a behavior to manifest. While we do not know exactly what genes and alleles cause men to find women attractive in general or specific features attractive, we do see repeatable patterns in behavior. The perfect example is waist-to-hip ratio. It has been repeatedly demonstrated that men find women with a lower waist-to-hip ratio to be more attractive than women with a higher waist-to-hip ratio. Waist-to-hip ratio refers to the difference between the circumference of a person's waist and their hips. A lower waist-to-hip ratio means that the waist is much smaller than the hips, or, conversely, that the hips are much larger than the waist. A low waist-to-hip ratio creates an hourglass-shaped figure. A high waist-to-hip ratio, on the other hand, means that the hips and waist are relatively the same. Previous research has suggested that the majority of men prefer a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7, meaning that the circumference of the waist is 70% of the circumference of the hips. According to a study published in Evolution and Human Behavior in 2010, even blind men appear to prefer low waist-to-hip ratios. What makes this experiment so interesting was the use of congenitally blind men to help remove the possibility of media influence on their ideal of beauty. To investigate what role visual information in the development of men's preference for low waist-to-hip ratio in women, Karemans and his colleagues had 19 blind men touch 2 mannequin dolls and rate their level of attractiveness. One mannequin had a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7, and the other had a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.84. The total volume of both mannequins was the same. The blind men recruited for this study were blind from birth, which ensured they had not received any visual input from Western media. In addition, 19 sighted men were given instructions to view the two mannequins and rate their level of attractiveness. Another 19 sighted men were blindfolded and instructed to feel the mannequins and rate their level of attractiveness. Karemans and his colleagues found that the majority of the participants in all three groups preferred the mannequin with a 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio. On a 10-point scale, the average rating for the 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio mannequin was about 7 for the blind participants, about 8 for the participants allowed to see the mannequin, and about 7.5 for the blindfolded participants. In contrast, the blind men gave the mannequins with a higher waist-to-hip ratio an average rating of 6.25, the sighted men gave an average rating of 6.5, and the blindfolded men gave an average rating of about 7. So the results have indicated that visual input is not necessary in regards to preference of women's body shapes, but it seems almost universal that the lower the hip-to-waist ratio is preferred by most men, regardless of social conditioning, despite the claims of many social constructionists about media and its harmful effects of masculinity and the so-called oppressive beauty ideal for women. Now, it is important to note that it is possible that even the blind men may have been verbally told about what is culturally considered attractive, and that may skew the results. But it seems far more likely that this preference may stem from a more generic psychological mechanism and other more intrinsic psychological mechanisms. Having a low waist-to-hip ratio has been medically associated with health and fertility in women, and thus men who preferred women with lower waist-to-hip ratios may have had healthier offspring. It should then come as no surprise that men who exhibited this preference in women should then pass this ability to manifest this preference to their offspring, and thus the feedback loop is created for population propensity to prefer women with lower waist-to-hip ratios. Does this mean all men share this preference? No, of course not. Having the ability to manifest a behavior, as noted earlier, does not mean that someone must necessarily manifest this behavior. Does it mean all men will only find women with a low waist-to-hip ratio attractive, and thus mean they will never find a woman with a larger waist-to-hip ratio attractive? Or does it mean they will instantly cheat on their partners with a woman with a low waist-to-hip ratio? Of course not. It is merely one factor in a vastly complex equation of what a man is attracted to in a woman. Now we come to the really controversial one that still causes jerky knees, even within communities that will quite happily have watched this video until this point and not seen anything wrong with what has been laid out thus far. And yet this will inevitably be the part that gets people upset. What women find attractive in men. It has long been established that women are largely attracted to cues of social dominance and success in men, in the same way that men are largely attracted to cues of youth and fertility in women. Now I know we already have the straw man ready, so you're saying all women are genetically programmed to be gold-digging, cheating whores? No. In the same way that men are attracted to signs of youth and fertility, this does not prescribe for them a lifetime of forever cheating on their partners with someone younger and hotter. Women's attraction to signs of social dominance and success does not prescribe all women to a lifetime of chasing men's Veblen goods, wallets, muscles, and physical height. For this example, we will examine physical height, since it seems the least controversial of the overall G, that is, social status. As with men's attractions to women's waist-to-hip ratio, women's attraction to male height does show some variance, but also shows a consistent pattern with a few interesting deviances. 2 meta-analyses of multiple studies was published in a paper in Social Behavior and Personality, an international journal. These meta-analyses of multiple studies have found that the man-taller social norm is consistent across studies. With respect to body height and actual data and mating choice, a pervasive social phenomenon among romantically involved dyads is that the male is taller than his female partner. Indeed, several non-experimental investigations have provided support for what is considered the male-taller social norm in romantic partner selection. Gillis and Avis 1980, for example, obtained height data from bank account applications of 720 couples and found that only one couple consisted of a male who was shorter than his female counterpart. Cameron, Oscamp and Sparks 1977 content analysed a singles newspaper and reported that over 80% of the female advertisers desired to date tall men, or men who were at least 4 inches taller than their own proclaimed height. Lynn and Shergott 1984 obtained height information from a singles magazine and determined that males who advertised their tallness received more responses from females than males who reported that they were short. Kirshner and Wheeler 1988, who also examined personal advertisements in newspapers, reported that 14% of the female ads referred to height as a desired characteristic, whereas only 7% of the male ads contained references to the desired height of a female. In contrast, other researchers have reported findings inconsistent with the male-taller social norm. Grazio et al. 1978, for example, experimentally examined this cardinal principle in date selection and ascertained that males of medium stature were more desirable to date from a female's perspective than either taller or shorter males. Nevertheless, Graziano also reported that taller males are perceived as more desirable dating partners than shorter males. So basically, taller men were still desirable as long as they weren't freakishly tall. And after looking across no less than 14 studies, results indicated that the strength of the effect of body height on influencing romantic attraction was slightly greater for females evaluating males than males evaluating females. That is, females desire males who are taller than themselves to a greater extent than males desire females who are shorter than themselves. The predicted height finding is consistent with both the male-taller norm and the cardinal principle of dating selection. Moreover, support for the male-taller norm lends credence to Burscheid and Walsher's claim that height is a more important component of a male's perceived level of attractiveness. Explanations as to why this norm exists has been purported in the attraction literature. Several of Beagle's respondents, for example, equated a male's tallness with favourable personality traits, such as dominance, superiority, fearlessness, protectiveness, and ambitiousness, as well as characteristic of commanding attention. In addition, male height was also equated with leadership qualities, athleticism, and sheer physical strength. Lynn and Shergott posited that a male's height is associated with social power, and that females may desire powerful romantic partners more so than males. Perhaps females perceive a sense of security by dating taller males. These propositions are consistent with Feldman's claim, to be tall is to be good, and to be short is to be stigmatized. Stated differently, females tend to attribute positive qualities toward a male partner who is as tall or taller than themselves. Alternatively, it may be the case that the norm exists simply because the average American male is 4.5 inches taller than the average American female. Future research should address these and other plausible reasons for the existence of the male-taller phenomenon. So while it might be nice to have further research on this, it seems again a more or less universal pattern, which when you regress backwards and consider the early roles that societies had for men and women, it makes perfect sense that women would favour men who are physically larger, stronger, more athletic, as means of protecting them. Indeed, this is a pattern that was more than likely forged in humanity since before humans were even human. So while some women are less inclined to be bothered by the height of their male partners, most still exhibit this preference in the same way men exhibit a near-universal pattern of preference for waist-to-hip ratio with only a little variance. To add further weight to the idea that this pattern of preference has a basis in biology, consider also the findings of a study published in Biological Psychology. Women's preferences for sexual dimorphism in height depends on menstrual cycle phase and expected duration of relationship. Human mate preferences are related to many morphological traits, such as female waist-to-hip ratio, body mass index, male height, or facial symmetry. People also vary in preferences for sexual dimorphism in stature between themselves and a potential partner. Here we demonstrate that women adjust their preferences for sexual dimorphism in stature not only in relation to their own height, but also in relation to 1. The phase of menstrual cycle during which their preferences were studied, and 2. The sexual strategy, short versus long term, that they were asked to choose. Taller males were preferred more often when women were in the fertile phase of their menstrual cycle and when the partners were chosen for short-term relationships. These effects were independent of woman's height. The results show that women in their potentially fertile phase of their menstrual cycle and when choosing a partner who might be less likely to invest in children select genes of taller males. Now, I suppose to repeat the lengthy list of disclaimers that has been universal throughout this video because these straw men will never die, this research does not prescribe for women a lifetime of always trying to find a man who is taller than their current male partner. It does not prescribe that no woman will ever have a male partner who is shorter than them, but it does give us a near universal norm that women prefer men taller than them, and owing to how this level of desire changes as their hormonal state fluctuates, it is clear that this desire is, at least partly, connected to biology, in the same way men's attraction to women with a lower waist-hip ratio is. But what about environment? Once again, as a factor, this behavior might manifest differently according to environment. If only men of equal height are available, then of course women in this environment will show no preference for height, because it is not available to them as a criterion. In such an environment, it would be interesting to hypothesize that maybe women would begin finding men who wore high heels attractive. What is interesting about these last two examples is that you don't necessarily have to know the specific gene or genes that relate to a behavior to begin to understand that that behavior has a basis in biology. Indeed, it is our ability to control for environmental and social factors that leads us to begin being able to conclude that there is some biological influence on the behavior. And to finish up what is already a lengthy video, let's consider how the same trait, attraction to social status, changes with the environment. Consider, if you will, what is currently considered attractive. No doubt you'll be thinking slim, toned muscles, tanned, etc. Where did this come from? Considering just over 100 years ago, attractive was a slightly larger body type, pale, and muscles didn't matter. Well, this just proves that attraction is a social construct, right? Well, no. This is an example of the same behavior changing according to the environment. In the past, in the West, being pale and on the larger side of healthy without the need for excess muscles was considered a sign of wealth. You didn't have to go outside and labor in the sun, darkening your skin and hardening your muscles like the peasants. And unlike the peasants, you could afford to eat well, not only in quantity, but also in quality, in a time where things like sugar were an expensive foreign import obtained by month-long sea or land journeys. To be able to eat it and thus put on excess body fat, but not to the point of obesity, was a sign of wealth and success, and thus these things were attractive. Fast forward to the modern time, what do we find now? The complete opposite. But why? Because to have muscles requires a gym membership, which requires disposable income and disposable time, because you don't have to work a menial job 40, 50, 60 hours a week to pay for yourself to live, and you're able to buy the right kind of often expensive foods and supplements. To have a tan shows exotic travel locations and holidays, again, disposable income and disposable time. Although this one can be faked with tans, which are even sold with taglines like, "Look like you've just come back from an exotic, and therefore expensive, holiday." Of course, in our past example, did poor women find the pale, effete aristocracy universally attractive? Of course not. Some would, but most would be attracted to the signs of social success and dominance within their own environment. The rough, muscular, strong, stable hand or blacksmith, for instance. All these seemingly disparate examples at different times in different environments, everything seemingly totally different and yet all indicative of the exact same pattern of behavior. Is this to say culture and society has zero impact, as the straw men love to shout? Of course not. Society and culture absolutely have effects, since these are part of the environment that our genes are reacting to. But to try to play the epigenetics card, the idea that just because an environment can change how behavior is manifest is somehow proof that said behavior has no basis in human biology, is absurd, laughable, and demonstrates a level of ignorance on the subject that is nothing short of astounding. There are so many ways to test and control for all the variables of society and culture, etc., to draw our conclusions as to some biological impact on behaviours. And with that, I think I just need to leave off with a quote from Dr. Gad Saad, Professor of Evolutionary Psychology and Marketing. Anyone who says that evolutionary psychology cannot be tested is stating the following: I am unfathomably idiotic. Hopefully this has been interesting and thought-provoking for you, maybe even a little bit educational. Now let's sit and laugh at the inevitable #notalls and similar arguments that inevitably follow any video on this topic, no matter how much or how clearly you state that biology does not prescribe behaviour in itself, nor how it must manifest, but is merely one part of the equation leading to observable patterns and propensities.